have some sound. I'm so happy to be here. Am I allowed to speak now? Okay. And am I allowed to have my glasses? I think it's better so that I don't forget some names. There are so many people I want to thank. So, of course, thanks for being here first. This is the first day of our discursive program. Tomorrow will be the second day. Today I have the pleasure to introduce Malcom Ferdinand here, Sami Baloji online, Imani, Jacqueline Brown just arrived, and tomorrow Doreen Mende, Etinoza Yvonne, Eyal Weisman, Joseph Tonda, Jürgen Semmerer, Leis Kerim, Regine Sahakian, Samane Moafi, Stefania Pandolfo, that I just saw, and Suzanne Choupli. The beginning of our program, the first event is called Imperial Ecology. But before to start some explanation, I also would like to thank for their precious support. Our editorial committee, whose critical help has been tremendously important to learn and unlearn in the world of my dear friends Ariela Azoulay, learn and unlearn from our certainties. So Tarek Al-Hadis, Irit Rogoff, Felwin Sarr, Rolando Vasquez, Zakia Iman Jackson, Benedict Savoie. We're going to be in live stream on the internet. So thanks to the University Berliner Hochschule für Technik, sorry for my accent. And I see you guys, so I really take the opportunity to tell you thanks. I would like also to thank for the generous support our partners, the Federal Government Commissioner for Culture and Media, the Federal Agency for Civic Education, Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, and the Open Society. And of course, I would like to thank the Hamburger Bahnhof, the venue where we are here, their team, the director, for welcoming also the Berlin Biennale, and our first event entitled Imperial Ecology. Wow, I have so many people to thank, but it's important. Last but not least, to my close collaborator and artistic team, Anna Teixeira Pinto, Rasha Salti, Noam Segal, Lynn Dotuong, and Marie-Hélène Pereira, with whom each reflection from artists to topics of the Biennale that has led to this program has been a crucial help. The Berlin Biennale team, of course, and its director, the great Gabi Horn, with whom the collaboration on this important project has always been a fruitful and balanced dialogue. But we could have not done all this without the whole army of other wonderful people and minds who worked on the Biennale. So to just name a few who worked on this program, I would like to thank Sabine Weyer, June Drevet, Alix Hugonnier. From the intellectual to the structural, this project has been possible thanks to you. You have to be proud. Regimes of invisibility. We have inherited of a world with blind spots because of the regime of invisibility, which have structured the domination of the West on the non-Western peoples through slavery and colonialism. The rhetoric of the post-colonial time, uttered by the former colonizers, is embedded into a regime of invisibility of the crimes committed during occupation. Because colonialism has been also the tool of modern capitalism, we need to understand that the regime of invisibility, which have made these crimes of slavery, colonialism, and all forms of mass murder possible, are inscribed in the agency of technology and capitalism and its blind obsession for growth. Collective trauma, to quote the psychoanalyst Karim Al-Azali, which are still haunting our society, but whose wounds are not anymore visible. Eyal Weisman, Jürgen Semmerer, Samane Moafi, Suzanne Choupli, and Doreen Mende will bring tomorrow some much needed elaborated decolonial strategies to help us to see in a sharp way the colonial crime that has been invisibilized. as well as Jürgen Zimmerer, whose reflection on the need to name the crime is part of the history as a process that we have to share in order to get rid of the dystopic narrative the capitalist West has been constantly uttering. Jürgen Zimmerer will be the keynote of tomorrow. Each event has a keynote. Tonight will be Malcom Ferdinand. We will come back to him right now. Reappropriation of our noetic dreams, of our dream that generate thought. When it comes to the complexity of dreams, thinkers like Joseph Tonda, who is also with us tomorrow, from Gabon, psychoanalyst Karim Al-Azali, anthropologist Stefania Pandolfo, also with us tomorrow, but also Frantz Fanon, of course, who sees the dream as anti-colonialist. I'm quoting. The first thing that the native learn is to stay in their place and not to exceed their limits. This is why the dreams of the native are muscular dreams, dreams of action, aggressive dreams. I dreamt, here I have to tell you that I found this note by reading a document that Alice Cherki gave me, who was the nurse of Fanon. And Frantz Fanon, every morning, like most of the psychiatrists, used to ask to his patient, what was your dream last night? I'm quoting again. I dream that I jump, that I swim, that I run, that I climb. I dream that I burst into laughter, that I cross the river in one stride, that I am chased by packs of cars that never catch up with me. Similarly, the Congolese-Gabonese sociologist Joseph Tonda has written, the first president of Gabon, Léomba, living image of the colonial dream, imperialist and neocolonial, transformed into an Afro-dystopian reality, is the product of the dream work of this machinic unconscious of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism. He is the living image of a dream that did not belong to him, but to this unconsciousness of domination, of subjection, of exploitation and dehumanization of the colonized and neocolonized. We are the pictures of a dream that does not belong to us. We must now understand the status of image dream, of the unconscious machine of imperialism that we are, in order to de-automatize them and reappropriate our sovereignty based on a hermeneutic of our imagination. Tomorrow we will speak about this with Joseph Tonda, and how much, like you said, Joseph, I don't see you, but I read you. Speaking, I'm quoting you, speaking from the continent, from Africa, I do think that my point of view is about the African subject, but globally, the human subject is the living image of imperialism. So we will continue on this tomorrow, super interesting. According to philosopher Bernard Stiegler, all humans' conceptual thought derives from dreams, noetic dreams. To go for the individual dreams to its collective realization is to open the possibility of an individuation, of a meaning that can be shared between individuals and group of individuals. In the automated society we inhabit, algorithmic governance bypass the production of meaning in order to extract data for economic. Here I'm quoting Bernard Stiegler and also Antoinette Rouvroy, a Belgian philosopher that he is quoting constantly in the book. Antoinette Rouvroy. Art opposes algorithmic governance by taking care of our dream and cultivating our power to de-automatize them. Today, being together here, gathered to listen and share other dreams, means a lot to me. Since La Colonie, the first space I have created years ago in Paris, with this purpose, I never had the chance to experiment such feeling of hope that still today, there are some possibilities to dream about a better world. As a mirror of the Biennale, our discursive program and spaces to think will reflect these 4 topics. What, as a metaphor, I name the 4 cardinal points of the compass that we need to map and understand the complex world we have inherited. A world built on modernity and its blind spots. Mapping the world we are in. So the 4 cardinal points. Decolonial heritage, decolonizing feminism, fascism, I mean the relation between fascism and colonialism. I'm referring here to Aimé Césaire, anti-colonialist speech 1956. And of course, decolonizing ecology. The public opinion always takes for granted that we are all ecologists. We all care about the environment because it means we do care about a future for our children, our family, and friends. No one disputes the need for a cleaner environment in the future. But the Western capitalist narrative cultivates the denial of the historical responsibility of capitalism and colonialism in the environmental catastrophe. Why? Because the destruction continues today, following the same logic of extraction from the south to the north. Tonight, we will resume, thanks to Malcom Ferdinand, our reflection on the need for decolonial ecology and its endless reinvention. Malcom will also dialogue after his lecture with Imani Brown and Sami Baloji. Now let me to introduce you to Malcom, and here I really have to read the bio. Malcom Ferdinand is an environmental engineer from University College London and doctor in political philosophy from Université Paris Diderot on the Black Atlantic and particularly the Caribbean. He explores the relation between current ecological crisis and the colonial history of modernity. He recently published a book based on his PhD dissertation entitled A Decolonial Ecology, Thinking of Ecology from the Caribbean World. Before we start with Malcom, I think, June, you have to say something regarding the Technik, please. Come.
Can you hear me?
I can give you mine.
I just wanted to give you some brief technical introduction. So as we are live streaming, it would be nice if you mute your phone. And then I wanted to say that we have scheduled some time for questions from the audience here in the room and also from online after each panel. We would like you to ask you to stand up or come in front and introduce yourself before asking your question. We have a mic with us and we are coming to your seat. And depending how much time is left, we will have some questions after Imani's presentation. And, no, we have some, sorry. We will have at the end, not after the keynote, but at the end we have some questions, time for it. So we collect it in the room at first and online via the email address conference@berlinbiennale.de. And then we will give them to the speakers to answer all at once. And last but not least, and Kader also said it, we are live streaming, so please don't do your own film recordings and sound recordings. Thank you. So, Malcom, the stage is yours.
Exactly.
Just set up here. Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here, first of all. Thank you, Kader, for this great introduction. I have a few people to thank, of course. Thank you, June Drevet, for all of the exchanges, even though sometimes, it's not very easy. I was everywhere. I want to thank Alex and I want to thank Sammy and Imani for being here. Okay. And so we try to have a great discussion today about Imperial ecologies, decolonial ecologies, and let's go. I time myself because I don't want to speak for too long too. Yeah. But before I start, I need to say, to also pay tribute to my ancestors. I come from those people, the colonial empires of Europe tried to eradicate, but failed. tried to silence but failed, tried to remove from their cultural belonging but failed, tried really hard to dehumanize but failed. And the reason why I say this and the reason why I'm able to stand is because of the resistance and the love of my ancestors who allow me to stand in front of you today. And I also speak from the bodily presence of a Martinican black man living in Paris. A country in France, a country that has proclaimed proudly in 1789 the rights of men and citizens, but refused to recognize those same rights to the enslaved Africans of Haiti and Martinique. A country that has declared slavery to be a crime against humanity in 2001, but has refused still to repay any form of reparation or justice to this day. And so I speak from the perspective of this body that reminds this colonial fiction of a nation state, both its failure and its humiliation. Now, that being said, let's embrace the subject of the day, which is about the relationship between colonizations, empires, and ecology. And most of the arguments that I will make today come from the book that has been recently translated, Decolonial Ecology. I have a few copies if you want to have a look later on today. So this presentation will have 4 parts, very quick parts. I will look at the double fracture, the divide, the way in which today we think, ecology has nothing to do with empire, and empire has nothing to do with ecology. And particularly, I want to look at one concept, the colonial inhabitation of the earth, with some cases from the French Outre-mer. I'll tell you what this is. And finally, we look at different types of decolonial ecologies, both from the Caribbean worlds, but also elsewhere. It's not just something from the Caribbean. So, yep, let's go. Sorry. If someone asks, well, why did you write this book? One of the main reasons why is I was confronted, as many ecologists and activists have been, with this divide. When one thinks about the environment, when all of the environmental movements, mainstream, ecological thoughts, it appears as if you would not need to engage with the colonial fractures of the world. And on the other hand, it appears as if the struggles, the anti-colonial struggles, the anti-slavery struggles, although they had some ecological wisdom, were invisibilized. And so you came with this fracture, and this is an example of that fracture. You have a picture here of a festival, a geography festival, that tries to represent the world facing the climate crisis. And you see who and what he presented here. A white man, well-educated, well-dressed, on an iceberg, far away, with a quote-unquote a noble animal, the bear. And bear in mind that most of the animals, the bodily mass of animals on Earth today, is not the bear, is not the wolf, it's not the whale. Environmental fracture here. You have a plethora of concepts, movements, thinkers, that have embraced this divide that has characterized modernity. Man, quote-unquote, above the planet. Nature, culture, environment, societies. And some have even tried to do this in a very critical way. Movements like political ecologies, social ecologies, ecofeminism to some extent. But yet, even the more radical, the more leftist propositions of ecological issues have failed to engage with the colonial fracture. And on the other hand, one can make the same argument that the anti-colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial critics may have failed to really grapple with the environmental conditions of their domination. I'll come back to that later. But what do I mean by that? What is the result, what is the consequence of this double fracture? The consequence is that you create a space, environmentalism, but has become a special refuge for whiteness, and whiteness becoming the horizon of that refuge. And so, let me give you some example. One of the founding person on national parks, John Muir, he founded some of the national parks in the west of the States, and pushed forth this idea of wilderness, an earth without a world, or a nature without indigenous people. And that idea of wilderness was built on the genocide of indigenous people, really. But still, it has been imbued in the American mind, as this book by Roderick Nash, and that notion of a nature to be preserved has also influenced other parks that have been created elsewhere in the world. And as you see, this is just a quote from some of his writing, a quote in which you see that the very conceptualization of nature was already racialized. What he says about, when he talks about a half-happy savages, dirty savages, living in a clean wilderness. There you see. And of course, I refer to you to the work of Dorceta Taylor, this brilliant historian, who really showed how the conservation movement in the States were already built on racist basis. When we talk about the relationship between empire and ecology, we need to look at the work of this person, Richard Grove. He wrote 2 major books, including this one, Green Imperialism, in which he makes this very, very important argument, saying, he asks himself, okay, where does it came, the idea of protecting the environment? Where does it came from? And with his historical research, he shows that actually the first policies, environmental policies, were not made in Europe, in Berlin, in France, or wherever, but were made in the European colonies, the European territories colonized either in the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. And in particular, he refers to that person, Pierre Poivre, who was the governor of one of the French colony called, at the time, Isle of France, and today Mauritius. And this person was the first one to implement policies to limit the local, quote-unquote, climate change. He was preserving the forest to keep the rain from, to keep or to prevent some sort of drought. But when he does that argument, the colonies appears to be just one scene like any other. And the role and the part played by the indigenous people, the knowledge of the enslaved, the knowledge of indigenous people did not matter at all. So even though he says, hey, we should look at what is happening in the colonies, he still, to some extent, do not recognize the voices of those that have been dominated, enslaved, and marginalized. Another example of this relationship between colonies, empires, ecologies, and so on and so forth, is two of his books. One is Diana K. Davis, a geographer, who showed how the colonization of the Northern Africa, the French colonization of Northern Africa, was justified on the idea that the locals were destroying nature. And so they invented that idea in order to say, well, we need to colonize you because you clearly do not know how to take care of the planet. That was the first part of the 19th century, 1830 and onwards. In this other book, the title is in French, The Invention of the Green Colonialism by Guillaume Blanc. He makes this argument that organizations like WWF and other experts had a biased understanding of what it means to create a national park in Africa and what it means to create a national park in France, in Les Cévennes. So in Les Cévennes, the relationship between humans and animals was celebrated, but in Africa, especially in Southern Africa, to preserve nature, you had to remove the locals, indigenous people, much like what was happening in the States. And One example he gives is why were there no humans in The Lion King, the cartoon or the movie. But then this green colonialism is not something accidental. It is at the very heart of what was understood to be nature and what was understood to be ecology. This is what. And the result is you have a space. It's not accidental that the spaces, the environmental spaces where we talk about ecology, both in university, both in in NGOs, have been overwhelmingly white. And I talk about white as a project, not necessarily as a list of bodies. This is a case some of you may be already familiar with of the funny situation that happened in Davos in 2020 at the World Economic Forum. 4 women went to denounce the actions of some multinationals. They were creating climate change, global warming. They took a picture, and when the picture was released in the press, only that picture was released. Obviously, someone and some things are missing. But what was interesting is, so Vanessa Nakate, she's a Ugandan woman. She founded 2 NGOs for ecological issues in Africa. She traveled to Switzerland and she saw her picture. She saw herself being cropped out of the picture, and she took to Twitter and said, "I understand now the word racism." And so the Associated Press answered and said, no, it's not racism. It was just an issue of composition. And I think we should take the word composition really at its core. It's that this environmentalism as a space of whiteness has also shaped what environmental advocacy should look like, and who should be part of it and who should not be part of it. So it was more interesting to have 4 white women in front of white snow Swiss mountain than this young black woman from Africa in front of buildings. And this is a divide between, for example, wilderness advocates and environmental justice activists. We'll come back to this. And she also saw that cropping her out of the picture is cropping out the voices of Africa, really. So, what are, again, some of the consequences? The consequences is the idea of it, that you can engage with ecological issues today without engaging with the colonial history of the world. And it's not just an accident, it's an active refusal. The idea that you don't need the others to talk about the Earth. I put here an op-ed by an ecological journal, quote unquote, in France, called La Décroissance, Degrowth. And this is a journal that dedicated 1 issue on my book, saying that because I brought up issues of inequalities, racism, colonization, that I was the one creating the divisions. So this is an active refusal to engage. And the hand that they use, they copied the symbol of a major anti-racist group in France called SOS Racisme. So yeah, and of course the other consequences is when you can, this is another example of some of the criticism you receive, part of the far-right groups. If you talk about decolonial issues, gender issues, intersectionality in France, you are subjected to this kind of criticism. It's part of the deal. And you can see Decolonial Ecology, you can see many other colleagues. Yeah, we can see the Pope. Yeah. But the result is you create an imaginary of the Earth that is oblivious to the stories of colonization, slavery, and empire. And not just the stories of domination, but the stories of resistance. And it creates a sense of irresponsibility. That means there is no need to atone, no need to engage with forms of reparation, no need to recognize any sort of crimes. I started this talk saying how I am a citizen of a country that has declared something to be a crime, but there's no need to pay reparation for it. There's no need for justice. Here it is again. Maybe in the questions I can talk about the metaphor of Noah's Ark, but I like to keep it going. So the first part, basically I showed how a certain idea of environmentalism can reproduce form of colonial domination. Now, in the second part, I'm going to show how colonialization itself also implies forms of destructive ecologies, if you will. So just both sides of the equation. Yep. So one of the key concepts I work with is this, to go over this double divide, which was at the start, is the concept of a colonial inhabitation. Now, what do I mean by that? Maybe sometimes it has been accustomed to think of colonization as the domination of a group of people over another group of people, as the land grabbing, as going away and taking over control of a country. That it is true. But more importantly, I think that colonization should be also understood as a way of inhabiting the earth. That's what it, and a way of conceiving and perceiving yourself in the world. And when you look at the examples, for example, of the French colonizations of the Caribbean and parts of the States and Canada and so on and so forth, they had a way of inhabiting the land that specifically excluded living with any other people that did not look like them, that did not pray to the same gods, that had different customs. So it was an inhabiting that only involves those that are Christian and so on and so forth. And so it's a very violent way of inhabiting. And when you situate yourself in the plantations, that was one of the forms of this, the plantations, the mines are different forms of these colonial inhabitations. Then you also assign a type of ontological status to these lands, where these lands, like Martinique, where I'm from, were not to be lands where you live, but lands that are meant to provide for the mainland. And so there has been what I've called a matricide, where this land has become motherless. And in my work, I also look at the way people try to recover that Mother Earth through different practices. And these are one picture of the sugarcane plantation. That was one of the major forms of the colonial inhabitation, both in the Americas, and to this day, it carries on with the banana plantation in Martinique and Guadeloupe. I move fast because I want to save time. I want to look at what happened in the 19th century. So slavery was abolished throughout this century. First in 1793, 94 in Haiti, then all the way to 1888 in Brazil. But I make the argument that one of the reasons why slavery was abolished, or one of the consequences of the abolition of slavery, was the expansion of this colonial inhabitation throughout the world. Up to this point, in Africa, there was only different spots where you would trade, but then the colonization and the changing of the earth, the cutting of the forest, replacing the plantation, started really in the 19th century. In 19th century, and so that idea was expanded to Africa, but also to other places. This is a map that you can find at the Decolonial Atlas of the territories that are under European control or by European settlers, and it's important that we see this not just as Europeans moving, but as this project of a colonial inhabitation. And one of the ways in which you can see this is also by the names, the politics of names. How often in the world you see, okay, this is New York, this is New Wales, this is New Caledonia. And so one of the major historian of empires is called Alfred Crosby. And he describes 1492 as being a Columbian exchange. And he shows how the European settlers wanted to recreate Europe's in Argentina, in other places, and so on and so forth. Bringing the cattle and bringing the names too. These are some of the different names in which we can refer to the earth, and I again encourage you to look at these different politics of namings. Now, I'm taking some specific case studies of the French Outre-mer. You see, not all of the former colonies became independent countries. Some decided to remain as part of the former colonial empires while seeking conditions of equality within that empire. This is a case of what we call the French Outre-mer. But if I were to ask you to locate the country France, I'm sure most of you would say, hey, it's there, it's the continent where you see with the hexagonal shape. But very rarely would you look at all of these territories. That France is actually a country that spans over 3 oceans. And what is surprising is that, and there are the remains of the French Empire really. What is surprising is that even in the French ecological thinking sphere, these territories are marginalized. And that is inconsequential for many reasons. One, because these are French citizens and they should be taken care of or looked at exactly the same way. 2, because of their importance in terms of biodiversity. 80% of the biodiversity of France is located in these territories. 80%. 98, you see, France has marine areas, an exclusive economic zone, that is the second in the world, 11 million square kilometers, just behind the States. Now, 98% of that area comes from these territories. You see, you plant a point on land, and then you draw a circle, 200 nautical miles, and that space is supposed to be yours. And yet, and that includes 10% of the world's corals, 20% of the world's atolls, but yet, still the voices, it's as if the former colonized had nothing to say about the earth and the world, which is for me at the heart of what ecology is. And here's one case of the way of the relationship between empire and ecology. As some of you may already know, France is now a nuclear power that has a standing at the UN, very important standing. But how did it get there? It started by testing nuclear bombs. First in the south of Algeria, and then in French Polynesia, quote-unquote French Polynesia, all the way to 1996. 193 nuclear bombs were tested. But that's not just the French who did that. The States tried nuclear bombs on the Navajo people in the States. The British used nuclear bombs in Australia on Aboriginal groups. So it's common practice to, marginalize, dominate indigenous people. But to this day, the people of French Polynesia are looking for justice. Here's one person, Oscar Temaru, who used to be president of Polynesia because they have a different arrangement for the constitution that allows them to have a president even though they are not independent, that is trying to trial France on the charge of crimes against humanity. But nobody, that's one case. Another case is the case of the the use of pesticides in plantations. This is something I'm working on at the moment. Because these islands were thought as basically major plantations, We use excessively a lot of pesticides, and some, including this one, chlordecone, is one that can stay in the soil for from tens of years to hundreds of years. And so even though it's not in use today, the people there are still contaminated by this pesticide. And it's been 50 years, we're still contaminated to this day, 50 years. It's been 15 or 16 years that there's been trials and still no justice. You see a theme recurring here. Yeah? Now I move to the, what are we going to do? So the last two parts are propositions for decolonial ecology and decolonial ecologies. This is what I worked on in my book. I tried to think, okay, in light of all of these, let's say, colonial ecologies, what can we suggest? What can we propose? And the way I did this is by thinking from the Caribbean world. That's the subtitle of the book. And one of the major gestures that I make is this epistemic shift. You see, when you ask who are the first people to think about ecologies, two names come up: Rousseau in France, Thoreau in the States. And I wanted to make this shift, knowing all too well that when Rousseau and Thoreau were going around the forests and doing all of their work and beautiful nature writing, there were women and children and men enslaved in the holds of slave ships. And my intuition was that they also had an idea of what it means to inhabit the earth, of what it means to be rejected from the world. They also had ecologies. So I wanted to situate myself from the perspective of those who at the same time that Rousseau and Thoreau wrote were enslaved, but also had a philosophy. And I wanted to try, okay, what would be their ecological philosophy? That was the epistemic gesture that I tried to do. That means a change in the way we produce knowledge. And one question, though, is you could not go to a already treaty on the philosophy of ecology of the Caribbean. So how would you go about it? And I took an advice from this famous scholar Henri Paget in his book Caliban's Reason, Afro-Caribbean Philosophy. And he asked this question, he tried to answer the question, where is the philosophy of the Caribbean people? Because it was not evident that Caribbean people could think. You know, that's the coloniality of knowledge. You are demonized, you are marginalized, you are believed that you cannot produce knowledge or anything. And so he suggested that we should look at the philosophical conceptualizations that are embedded in artistic work. And that's why we're also two major artists that will maybe look at that. And so I engaged with different forms of art to conceptualize a type of Caribbean ecologies, a decolonial ecology. I looked at sculptures, artists, novels, songs, and dances, and of course some of our famous thinkers and writers, Glissant, Condé, Frantz Fanon, and others. The result is the creation of a different genealogy of ecological thoughts, where I have different concepts, different themes, and I won't go into all of them, but it's a different imaginary of what ecology should be about, really. And one of the important theme is the theme of the maroon ecologies. See, there is this figure, the lonely walker figure. This is the figure of those who go in the wilderness and march very manly. This is the figure of Thoreau who go around, lives by himself, and Rousseau who does not live by himself, but anyway. And at the same time, there were people that were engaging in an anti-slavery struggle. The Maroons, for those who don't know, are the people who left the plantations, who fled the plantation to try and find life in places that were actually not very easy to live in swamps, mountains. Imani knows really well about Louisiana and so on and forth, but everywhere in the Americas, whether it's in Jamaica, Brazil with the Quilombos, Mexico, Martinique, Haiti. There were resistances to slavery. And these political resistances to slavery also carry ecological wisdom. They had to find a way to live both in opposition to the colonial and slavery system and yet try to find a way to live within a small, what anachronically would say, footprint. And instead of this standardization of the plantation, they would have to find a ingenuine mix with root vegetable, fruit, plants, cattle, and so on and so forth. And so this is something I think we should inherit, at least in the Caribbean, we choose to inherit from. And the fourth and concluding part is, this is a banner that was in Paris in 2021 by the Youth for Climate activists. These decolonial ecologies are actually the majority of ecologies on Earth. And you can find them everywhere. Now, I've given you some example of works in Latin and South America, works of Arturo Escobar, but also these 2 volumes of Ecologica Politica Latino America. You can find these also in different places in Africa. This is also the organization of Nimo Bassé and other works. And one trend I didn't talk about is the movement of environmental justice. Environmental justice that was actually created against environmental racism with the figures such as Laura Pulido, Robert Boulard, Benjamin Chavez. And they had this declaration of the principle of environmental justice in 1991, where the first line starts by, "We, the people of color, basically want to defend our rights to be on Earth and to live in a clean environment," and so on and so forth. So to conclude, what is decolonial ecology? Now I have the book that I wrote was published 3 years ago in France and in French. So I had time to take a step back and see what happened. And it has been received both well and bad, it depends, but almost as a type, as a branch of ecology. Oh, there is ecofeminism, there is political ecology, and then there is decolonial ecology, and then all you have to do is put another shirt on yourself, and that's it. And I think we should say something about what decolonizing means, but it's not just a type of ecology. It's really a different world understanding, an idea, a proposition to grasp the events of the world politically, philosophically, ethically, ontologically. And in that proposition, yes, there is the necessity to put together both the necessity to preserve the life conditions, but also to demand post-colonial, decolonial equality, gender equality, and so on and so forth. And the result of that change is that you see that the people that have engaged in environmental issues are much more, diverse, wide than we see. And I want to give a special shout out to Francia Marquez. She won the Goldman Prize in 2019. That is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for the Environment. And now she is the Vice President of Colombia. Yeah. And you have many figures, Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria, Amilcar Cabral, I forgot his name, Aimé Césaire, Kwame Nkrumah, and so on and so forth. And many indigenous peoples. You see, one of the problems with current mainstream environmentalism is you want to preserve the earth without dealing and engaging with the situation of indigenous peoples, and that can no longer stand. There are major works, especially by the NGO Survival International, who basically says you want to preserve the earth, start by recognizing the rights of indigenous people. And I think that's it for this presentation. So, to carry on the evening, we have we have two wonderful artists whose works are actually present in the Biennale that will speak. So first I will introduce, so there is Sami and Baloji and Imani, but first I will introduce Imani, and then Imani will speak for about 10 minutes. We'll have just a quick exchange, and then Sami will do the same, but he's not with us today, he's online. And again, a bit of an exchange, and then the floor will be open for questions. So Imani Jacqueline Brown is an artist, activist, and researcher from New Orleans, whose work investigates the continuum of extractivism from settler colonial genocide and slavery to contemporary gentrification, fossil fuel production, police and corporate impunity. In exposing the layers of violence and resistance that comprise the foundations of US society, she opens space to imagine a path to ecological reparation. So Imani, hi Sami. Imani, the floor is yours for about 10 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to time myself so I don't go over it. So first of all, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. It was brilliant. It was inspiring. It helped contextualize and frame so beautifully. I've learned so much, and you've also taken some of the pressure off of me to have to explain. So I'm very grateful. Sorry, I don't think I have the clicker. Fabulous. Thank you. So, yeah, as Malcom said, my work is here in Berlin, on display at the Akademie der Künste Tiergarten. It's been wonderful having this opportunity to actually make this new installation for the Berlin Biennale within the vision of Kader Attia, but I am going to just move on, and I hope that folk have had a chance to see it, and if not, we'll have a chance to see it. If not, it'll be on my website after the biennial closes, so everyone can engage with it. So I thought for this short presentation, I can go on and on for hours, so short presentation, I'd share some of the context behind the work to make it a bit more accessible. So as Malcom said, I'm from New Orleans, and Hurricane Katrina took place during my senior year of high school. This now very infamous storm left 80% of New Orleans, my hometown, underwater, and it displaced 100,000 Black people from the city, including my own family. Kind of in the top center of this image, in the distance, in a cloud of smog from some sort of, I learned, a wetland fire that had been burning for about a week, you can see the city of New Orleans there in the mist. So over the past 16 years, unbelievably or so, I've become really obsessed with untangling the causes, the root causes of this hurricane, understanding the forces that created this unnatural disaster. So of course, the meteorological forces are a given, perhaps, but there are so many more entangled, complex forces at play. In New Orleans, those forces are very tangible, they're visceral. The intense segregation of the city and the placement of the city's majority Black residents in the more precarious geographic areas of the city, the flood zones of the city. So we felt the impending catastrophe of Katrina every year, every summer, this kind of bittersweet moment where we get to bask in the sun but also have the threat of life-altering hurricanes coming through. So every year we would have experiences increasingly heightened, increasingly more frequent of flooding, even just after a rainstorm. And we're surrounded by this levee system that we enjoy as part of a public park, as one of the few public spaces in some parts of southern Louisiana. But this levee system, of course, was constructed in order to hold back the wider environment that we are dependent on, that we should be connected with, to hold back the wetlands that we see here. And this is somewhat, I guess I could say ironic, but actually really just sad and dangerous, because the levees hold back the river, which is conceived of as a threat. But the river is what actually built our land. It built our wetlands. And with the levee dividing the city from the river, the wetlands from its river, from its source. There's no way to replenish these wetlands. So in the foreground, you can see actually all that remains of Louisiana's incredibly fragile and necessary buffer zone. I say buffer zone, which is very anthropocentric, but of course these wetlands are a thriving ecosystem with inherent value, all of its own, all of their own. And it took 7,000 years for the river to build these wetlands in collaboration, one might say, with the geology, the greater continent, the outer continental shelf, even in collaboration with the rain and the storms that passed through, and indeed in collaboration with Louisiana's original indigenous inhabitants. There were over 24 groups in this region who called Louisiana Bulbancha, which meant place of many languages. It was so vibrant and interconnected. The indigenous peoples were oyster eaters, and they would eat oyster shells, and their shells would be left on the ground, and those shells would quite literally build land. So this whole process of land building, land maintenance, land protection is very much an ecological process, and humans are very much an essential part of that process, and we see such processes all around the world. But when I say we see only what remains, this is because since the 1930s, the oil and gas industry has discovered that Louisiana has, or at least had, one of the largest sources of oil and gas in the United States. And so they set out on this mission to try to extract these resources from our wetlands. And in order to do so, they had to somehow traverse these wetlands that were incredibly emergent. Places that might be land one moment would be water the next, and vice versa. And the animals living in these wetlands seemed to be quite opposed to the oil industry's presence. And so as they experimented with laying wooden boardwalks, the muskrats would come in and chew them away. And they couldn't, pave roads because, of course, they would be immediately flooded out. So instead, they just decided to carve through the wetlands. So we see here this kind of whiplashed skin of the wetlands. It's an illogical, haphazard crosshatch of canals that were dredged in order to drill. In this particular area, what we're seeing in the foreground is the Lafitte oil field, over 1,000 oil wells, and Chevron is one of the largest extractors in this particular area. So we can see here these industrial facilities kind of clinging to the land that remains. So what happens with these canals is that salt water comes in from the Gulf of Mexico and mixes with the brackish and fresh water in the wetlands, and it literally kills the vegetation that holds sediment together. There are many other add-on effects that I could talk about, but in a nutshell, it quite literally disintegrates the land, and the land floats out into the Gulf of Mexico. Similarly, they act as what we call hurricane highways, so they funnel storm surge from the Gulf of Mexico into the very vulnerable human communities all around Louisiana's coast. And when hurricanes come in, they kind of act like a bomb detonating in these wetlands because they're already so fragile, they've been so compromised that they explode. These images were shot in January of this year by a 3-passenger plane. And it's really, it's a strange thing, this type of ecological collapse, which, as you can see in this image, is clearly all around us, because one actually can't see the scale of this collapse from New Orleans. And most folk don't actually know that there are 10,000 miles of oil and gas canals dredged throughout our coastal wetlands in order to drill over 90,000 wells, and that there are 50,000 pipelines that connect from these wells up to the refineries up the Mississippi River. This whole fossil fuel production cycle and the violence that it emits at all stages of production remains just out of view. For us in, an urban environment like New Orleans, we have so much going on, and we're not, there's a massive media blackout that actually silences this narrative. But even for those who live a bit closer to the wetlands, who are in them, you really can't see the canals from the level of the water or the level of the ground. Reeds, marsh grass gets in the way. So you have to go above to actually comprehend the catastrophe that has been dredged by the state. So I'll go forward to say, as I said, the industry actually emits disaster at every stage of production. So we can actually go from these wells, we can follow the pipelines that connect the wells to 200 of the nation's most polluting petrochemical plants, refineries, and oil and gas storage tank farms in a region that was once called plantation country and is now known as the petrochemical corridor. So these 200 petrochemical plants occupy several fallow sugarcane plantations each. Neighbor historically black communities who trace their ancestry to people who were enslaved on those same grounds. Interestingly enough, from this perspective, we can also start to glimpse these little nodes of what one might call ecological resistance or ecological reparations. So historically enslaved people were denied stone in order to mark the graves of their loved ones. So they actually carried on a Pan-African tradition, a form of cultural retention that should be as well known and celebrated as jazz is, for example, where they would plant specific species of trees, magnolia and willow trees, to mark grave sites. So all across the petrochemical corridor, across plantation country, are these groves of trees that we might call sacred groves that are, in a way, actually these multi-generational forms of resistance. So the residents of these towns throughout southern Louisiana are rising up in resistance. One group has been formed called Rise St. James, and they are calling for a moratorium on the further development of industry in this region, in the petrochemical corridor, which they call Death Alley, in order to protect these groves of trees. But even more than that, these groves of trees are working with them in order to do their humblest to start to ameliorate the impacts of oil and gas production, just wrapping up in one sentence. Their roots are digging deep, and the mycelial networks are actually revitalizing the soil that has been exhausted by monocrop agriculture. And their leaves are doing their best to pull down the carbon dioxide that has been emitted by these plants. And so in this way, the front line of resistance against climate change is also the beginnings of extractivism, these plantations established during colonialism. So I didn't get anywhere near the end of my presentation, but I'm just going to stop.
So do we have time for one question? Yeah?
And then we add Sammy in 3 minutes.
Okay. So a quick question. So thank you for this beautiful and important presentation. One, I was very interested in this notion of ecological reparation that you mentioned, and this type of, let's say, accumulation of previous domination, like slavery, like in Nigeria, for example, where now we talk about Kensawira, or in Trinidad and Tobago that used to be a slave plantation but now is in a very oil-dependent country. How do you, through your art practice, bring together both the reparation in terms of reparation for slavery, let's say, and the reparation in terms of what's happening to the land, as you so beautifully knitted together?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. So I wanted to just show this slide quickly to answer this question and show the next. So for me, you know, as a human being, as a living person, it's really important to be thinking in terms of reparation, of repair, at the same time that I'm understanding, you know, the violence that, you know, has been slashing this region and that we're all immersed within. I think about these two, you know, essentially, I think about this continuum of extractivism that, you know, spans from colonialism to climate change, and extractivism as specifically a value system, a cosmology, one might say, that was imposed upon the world, that was exported all over the world by colonialism, and the kind of force of extractivism, the habituating, the establishing, the kind of maintenance force, power of extractivism is segregation. This notion, and you touched on this as well, that, you know, human beings are separated from their wider ecological bodies, and that black bodies are separated from the body of humanity. And this notion, this value system is what has, you know, driven us to this point, to the ends of the earth. But it also shows us, and I've made these kind of constellations out of oil and gas wells and pipelines. These are actual kind of formations of oil and gas infrastructure. I see them as these kind of like old gods in a way. And we, you know, can understand them, and in order to sort of turn our backs to them and start to understand, like to formulate different ways of understanding our place in the world, our relationships with each other. What you might call a decolonial ecology, I might call a black ecology, just as dark matter actually kind of occupies the interstitial space between all matter. It holds matter together, it absorbs light and holds it close to its bosom. We might think about blackness as being this space that we need to sit with, listen to, and welcome into ourselves and hold close to us, right? In order to rediscover, essentially, the paths to another horizon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we move quickly to Sami Baloji. Sami is with us? Yes? So a quick introduction again, and then Sami, you'll have also 10 minutes to speak. So Sami Baloji lives and works in Brussels and Lumumbashi. He's a photographer and video artist. Raised in Lumumbashi, Sami Baloji was sensitized to the colonial history and post-colonial decline of the once prosperous mining region of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Since 2005, Sami Baloji has been exploring the memory and the history of the Democratic Republic of Congo, highlighting the exploitation of people and the environment, as well as the lasting impact of the Belgian colonization. His work is an ongoing investigation of cultural, architectural, and industrial heritage of Katanga, a region profoundly shaped by the colonial mining industry. So, Sami, you have about 10 minutes to present your work, and then a quick question. Okay.
Thank you so much, Malcolm, for this introduction, and I would like to take this opportunity to firstly apologize for not being with you because of the strikes that are going on actually in Brussels. And I would like to thank you, Kader, Attia, for the invitation, and all the team and the technical team who somehow arranged that I can be with you, even though that I couldn't make it physically. So I would like to talk about a presentation that was asked to me for this panel. So basically, I'm from Lubumbashi, so it's the second town of Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's in the southern part, and it's part of the province called Katanga, where there are a lot of mineral resources, such as uranium, that actually was used for the atomic bomb came from Katanga. You don't have lithium, copper, cobalt, so it's a place where there are mining extraction that has been going on since the colonial period. and talking about the colonial period. So this Congo started in its shape as it is today. It started with Stanley explorations and also the Berlin conference that happened in 1885, where most of part of the African continent were divided into countries, the 54 countries that we have today. And my work has been really looking at the urban landscape of my city, but also Congolese cities. Most of them were created during the colonial period. And looking at the way that they were segregated in their shape. So basically, as you can see in this map, there are two main cities in the same city. So above there is the European city, and just under what is called the Cité Albert was the indigenous city during the colonial period. But those cities were divided by what was called a cordon sanitaire. And the cities were mainly to provide people for the mining exploitation that was going on. And here you can see the picture, aerial view of the city. So above you have the European and down you have the black indigenous city. And on your left you do have the mining area that it's been really important. And as you can see in the presentation, I have to find a way to move, sorry, my screen. And as you can find in this urban manifest that was published in 1931 during the colonial period, it says the neutral zone, so the cordon sanitaire that I was talking about, the neutral zone evokes close contact between whites and blacks. An almost empty area measuring of minimum of 500 meters separate their two areas of settlement. This distance corresponding to that which a malaria-carrying mosquito would normally cover. The neutral zone thus divides the lives of black from those of white. It keeps the latter safe from the sources of malaria and from the worldly activities of blacks, so creating completely independent living conditions for each race. It is a true cordon sanitaire placed at a right angle from the prevailing winds. Our urban planning contents itself with creating development that satisfy conditions of hygiene, salubrity, and security, giving the white and the black races the opportunity to. It's the third wagon that was meant for indigenous people, so the black and Asiatic people. But it's also talking about the hygiene. It's all the methods that were also produced during the colonial system in order to dominate black bodies, but also to really create this notion of inferiority, such as what we can see in this picture. On the back of the picture, it says, fly control campaign. Each worker must bring 50 flies in order to receive his daily ration. So this picture was taken in October the 3rd in 1929. So these systems were really violent, and I had a chance, about just curiosity, by visiting the Museum of Lubumbashi. I came across in the entomology department, I found the boxes of different new habitations and new shades, and combining them with all those boxes of flies that I discovered. So this work was done in 2013. But talking about the mining exploitation, I would like also to point this fact that, of course, the colonial system was based on the exploitations of mineral resources. So most of the colonial administrators and scientists were kind of mapping and also trying to understand where are the places where they could find mineral resources to exploit. And all these informations are kept here in Belgium at the Tervuren Museum, for example, in the Department of geology or in other services in Belgium. And that makes somehow the Congolese Minister of Mining depending on the information that it's kept, that are kept here in Belgium. For example, for this map I was looking after, it's a map of another city in Katanga, which is called Kolwezi, where I was interested in figuring out where there are artisanal mining going on, exploitations going on, and where are also the industrial mining happening. So I went to the Toronto Museum asking if I could get access to maps that would help me to localize all these sort of exploitations going on. And they told me that as an artist, I was not allowed to have these kinds of information. But as I've been working most of the time with them, they could allow me to have the map, but by erasing all the names and information. So I had this map, which is completely an abstract map, but at the same time, showing somehow the power relationship and the mapping of territories that has been done in terms of invention. As Valentin Mudimbe, who's a Congolese philosopher, said once in his book called The Invention of African Gnosis, Philosophy and the Order of Knowledge, he said that the colonial system is based on domination of physical space, the reformation of native minds, and the integration of local economy histories in the Western perspective. So again, talking about map, I came across this, there are many maps, because I wanted to go back to the pre-colonial period, because somehow, as I said since the beginning, that it's since 1885 that Congo started to exist. So I wanted to see back in time and see what is the reality of the same space? And I came across this map that I'm showing you that was made in 1829. And you can see that the part where Congo is, it's kind of interesting because you do have on your left Congo, Angola, and Luango, which was part of the Congo Kingdom. And the area where there was supposed to, there are now Katanga, is what is written in French, contrée tout à fait inconnue. So I'm actually part of this part that is called an unknown area. But they're also digging just into the pre-colonial time. I started also to look at the Congo Kingdom, and I came across this letter of Alfonso Premier, who was one of the first king, the second king actually, to collaborate with Portuguese and Rome. And the later written in 1514, which is part of the collection, the archives in Lisbon, is a letter that where you can find the king speaking about the evangelization and acculturation, as there were Christians living in Congo at that time. And the later addressed also topics of slave trade, but also the presence of Congolese students in Portugal, or matter concerning justice, or even the fact of one of the princes was named Bishop of Congo and part of the Catholic religion, and that was back in 1530. But also the later speaks about the relation with Rome. And that also inspired me to really start to look at all those trade and relationship that was happening between Europe and Congo back in the 15th century. And I came across also on this book made by Ezio Bassani.
Sammy?
Yeah?
Sammy, I think we have to wrap up so that we can have some exchanges with the public.
Okay, cool. Should I stop now, or?
If you want to have a concluding line, and then I can ask a question.
Yeah. So by looking at the pre-colonial time, I started to be interested in, the two mnemonic devices, which are part of Luba's community. I'm from Luba, and one of the things is really to, by relying on those mnemonic devices, what I'm interested in one hand is to recognize and acknowledge the genealogy of those people in the pre-colonial time and how they were, and even today, and how they've been living and transmitting knowledge. And this is, on one side, the Casala, which is a poem that is performed at a ceremonial period and that is meant to celebrate a human being. And also this wooden sculpture, which is used by Ubudie sacred people who are somehow able to keep the king's memory. So these are the two tools that I've been researching, and the reason why that I've been interested in that can be found in those two sentences. Two paragraphs, and then I will stop. One is part of exchanges that I've been having with the Professor Alan Roberts around these two mnemonic devices, and he was saying that, writing to me and saying that my sense is that if there can be any hope of decolonizing Eurocentric approaches to Congolese ontology, practices, and aspiration, one has to begin with basic differences between local senses of identity and the nature of history and those of capitalist hierarchical hegemonic assumptions that were imposed by earlier colonial agents and sad to say are not the reality of a lot of Congolese, but are now the reality of a lot of Congolese themselves. Lucas' logic is based upon constant negotiation of truth, recognizing that there will always be disagreements about what constitutes truth in the first place. An analogy can be drawn to the horizontal rhizomatic relationship discussed by Deleuze and Guattari, with the recognition that even their provocations aren't needed to appreciate the brilliance of Luba thought.
Thank you.
And then the last one, it's by Valentin saying, all memory is part of life and of a history in movement, and therefore of its omission. Far from opposing each other, it is clear that African memories, ancient and colonial, rather complement each other. I think I embody that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sammy. Thank you for this beautiful presentation, for this wonderful work. I was very interested in the classification you showed that goes from, human, animals, and land. And one of the factors of this, what I refer to as the colonial inhabitation, is that there are places, like in Louisiana, where you see that the violence is so intense, is so strong, and yet what is produced from these places come to the places in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris. And I wonder if you have any reflection on the reception of your work, whether through your work people have been able to see that the minerals, for example, that comes, or even the electric batteries now that we have in cars, actually comes from this very both racist, colonial, and violent practice in Congo.
Thank you for your question. I think it's, on my side, it's really a journey, because as I was presenting the work, it's that I've been born and raised in Lubumbashi, which is a so-called modern city with a colonial background and with the violence that I've been addressing, and you've been also addressing in respectively your research, and even Imani also. But the thing is that the fact of being raised there is a silence around the colonial history, while we're still living in the colonial system and its legacies, as I was showing there. But it is also the same reality that can be encountered in Europe, but even here in Belgium, where people don't really know about the colonial system. And it's been just like maybe last 10 years that things are coming slowly out, but there's been a propaganda that has been dividing all these people and keeping us in a sort of norm, and by just adopting the modernity as something that is part of a normal life in a way. So I think in my work, and as I was addressing the last sentence, the last paragraph by Mudimbe, I've been combining research and personal also experiences in order to somehow shift the view behind what can be seen as a modern production coming from Africa, but still also addressing issues that were hidden for decades now. Yeah. So the reception, it's I've been contextualizing a lot of my work so that people can also get access to archives and start also to realize that it's more profound than just producing aesthetics and forms. And yeah.
Thank you for your answer, and so thank you, Sammy. So maybe now we can open up the floor to any questions in the public.
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Sami, and thank you, Imani. So please raise your hands if you have a question, and Hannah is coming from the back, maybe. And we collect the three, maybe, and then we pass it over to Malcolm and Imani.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, I can please stand up. Of course. Thank you for the presentation. I think it's really an interesting topic. My name is Clem. I work as a product manager. I was asked to do an intro, so I work as a product manager for decentralized systems, and I looked into the field of governance and other topics. But yeah, my question is about examples of like good initiatives that you think take into account this kind of, colonialist bias that we have with regards to environmental ecology. And I asked that really because a few years back I was reading a report from McKinsey where they were all about this idea of reforestation and preservation and restoration of places, but always with the angle and somewhat the bias of producing economical value. Whereas it could very much be the case that if we do take into account this bias at the very basis of preservation, the even dimension of economic viability can just be denied and put aside. So I wonder what kind of first if you have examples of like initiatives that account for these biases, and then secondly, yeah, if there's you think that there is practical steps, I think you mentioned justice. I think justice is probably, probably rule number one in my view. And for as long as this doesn't happen, I really wonder how we can get out of this, nightmare or whatever. Yeah, it's bad.
Thank you. I think here was also a question, and here in the front.
Hello, my name is Emilio. I'm from Mexico City. I'm a student in philosophy, and again, thank you. I'm very interested in what I saw as the overlapping concern with memory, in the idea of the sacred groves, and in the archives, and in general, this vision of retelling history from a new perspective. Especially, I'm only visiting Berlin for a little bit, and I was completely struck by the amount of I visited the Jewish Museum, I visited the Holocaust Memorial, and it seems like memory is an essential part of the process, at least in these kind of horrors that are very present in the geography of Berlin. And so I wonder what your concept of a memorial is, if that's even valuable, and yeah, anything you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Iyad Hossami. I work in theater, agriculture, and ecology. I was struck by the concept of repair in your presentation, Imani, and also how that concept is often used actually by industrial agriculture corporations to advance efforts to chemicalize processes of agricultural production. So I just wanted to make that comment that repair is also used by sort of the dark side of this discourse to advance their own agenda. And then I also wanted to comment and ask a question about sort of the epistemological dimensions of your presentation, Malcom. You drew a contrast between indigenous forms of knowledge and sort of the colonial forms of knowledge. And you cited how environmentalism, you sort of framed the creation of environmentalism as a space for whiteness. And I'm curious if you could comment on the methods of transmission of these modes of thought. I think often a lot of emphasis is placed on sort of creation points, origin stories for new traditions, new genealogies of knowledge. But how are these genealogies sustained? And what are the different ways in which these traditions are passed on? I guess the Lukasa logic is one concrete example, but maybe you have other thoughts.
Thank you. We have one fourth question I would add from online by Cecilia.
Yes, I will read that. So I quote, my question is, should we decolonize or create an ecological abolitionism, refusing the frameworks that constructed the main knowledge infrastructures that translate certain environmental agendas? Here I am thinking from a Latin American perspective and indigenous influence.
So how do you want to proceed? Maybe like for 4 questions, I'm not sure I got if I can read if we can read the final questions, the two of us, if you can have a look at it would be easier.
Yeah.
But
sorry, yeah, I couldn't hear either.
Because I couldn't hear really well.
Okay.
But I can try to answer the first question, and then maybe the memory one, and Sammy and you can answer the other one. So, sure. The question was a good example. What would be a good example? I think the major problem with mainstream environmentalism is we lose sight of one founding question, the question of world making. And so as long as you design your projects with only an environmentalist horizon, and not asking the question, what kind of world does that project create with the humans, with the different people, with the different more than humans elements that are part of the ecosystems, then you run the risk of creating any types of, even ecofascism, any types of practices that do not address the question. And that's why, for example, the work, what I think of Imani and Sammy are important, because what they show is there are worlds that are hidden to us. And the fact that they are hidden to us gives us here a certain comfort. It's easy. But this work of showing the worlds that we should engage with, so the question of the world making, and justice in that question, the struggle for justice is a path towards world making. So as long as you keep that question asking constantly, how can I create a world, and who can be part of the world that I do with this project, that would be some of the answer. And then there are many initiatives, artistic, political, we can talk later in the Caribbean, in the environmental justice movement, for example, in the States is one of them. But there are initiatives in France also, so I would maybe just answer the final question and then you jump in. So, thank you for the question. How is that history or genealogy, which is something different? Because that's the thing. For me, genealogy is really the task of choosing from whom you inherit and from whom you do not inherit. And what is fascinating is that a lot of the anthologies that would place Thoreau and Rousseau as the founding quote-unquote fathers of environmentalism are anthologies that have been published in the last 10 years, so after 2000. And the fact that environmental spheres are not diverse, mainly white, mainly male, That has changed to some respect. It's not new. We didn't learn about this in 2022, and that's a question I have. Why, knowing that, does it still continue? And there are different mechanisms that I have one paper coming out, especially asking this question. There are different mechanisms that allows that. One of them is what Hannibal Quijano called the coloniality of knowledge. That means you produce and you institutionalize a type of knowledge around ecology and the environment that does not allow a grammar for engaging with indigenous knowledge, engaging with the stories and histories of the colonized. Another way is only looking at these events as a measurement. Okay, well, there were slavery, there were colonization, but this is just a tiny little amount of greenhouse gases emission compared to the vast scope of the Anthropocene. So there are different mechanisms which allow certain things to continue, even to the point where I think it has become common practice for some NGOs to kind of, give some lash in the back, oh, we're not very diverse, but it really doesn't change, like we still gotta save the earth, so. Yeah, these mechanisms, I think, should be investigated in each context, but one major one is the way we produce knowledge about what is ecology and what isn't ecology. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for taking those questions. Yeah, I'll speak about repair. I'm really excited to speak about repair. I'm not familiar with the way that agricultural corporations use the word, but I can assure you I'm using it in a very different way. When I speak about repair, I think about repair as an offering, as a ritual, as a gesture. I think about repair in the sense of repairing the fissures that have been driven through existence by segregation. So the way that Black activists with Rise St. James are collaborating with these micro ecosystems that were seeded by their ancestors, that's a form of repair. It's a repair of the fissures driven between peoples, species, generations, dimensions, so on and so forth. There's another type of repair that is often touted as being, and first I'll say that I always think of repair as, in the context of reparations, okay, and I'll come back to that. But there's another type of repair being proffered as a solution to our ecological crises in Louisiana, and that's a state master plan. So the state, of course, acknowledges the disaster that's been caused by the oil industry. We've lost 2,000 square miles of land, I didn't say that before, as a result of oil extraction, but they completely they omit the fact that the oil industry is responsible for that repair. They'll put a little bit of onus on the levee system, but of course this is something that is inevitable, right? They say, to live in this land. So it's the cost, that comes with living there. But there is no attempt to actually recognize and hold accountable the 100 or so oil corporations, and fewer today after a series of corporate mergers and successions, that have actually catalyzed this land loss. This is some of the work that I tried to do. So you saw a bit of mapping, and I didn't speak of it at all because I'm a little loopy. I just got off a 7-hour train. And I've been trying to map oil and gas infrastructure by company over the past few years. And those are the GIS data points and lines that you see that become the constellations. But the state, so actually has a proposal, and it's to cut these fissures in the levee system exactly at that point where we saw, where my first image was of the Lafitte oil field. So they want to cut these massive breaches in the levee, which will allow the river to flood these wetlands. And their notion is that this will allow the river's alluvial sediment to flow into the wetlands and rebuild them. It's a really leaky logic because it's essentially, you need to stem the bleeding the water that's going to flood into these wetlands carrying sediment is just going to flow out through the oil and gas canals that are letting the water and salt in from the Gulf of Mexico. This has been challenged by a number of scientists, including Eugene Turner, who actually did a study and showed that it would be a mere $100 million or so to backfill all of the 10,000 miles of oil and gas networks. Compare this to the $25 billion at a conservative estimate, likely over $100 billion master plan that would cut this fissure into the levee and would very likely do nothing at all, actually just flood out the indigenous and black oyster fisher communities that actually are still surviving in that area. But the state completely omits Dr. Eugene Turner's and other scientists' studies and proposal for repair as actually stemming the bleeding, as stopping the continued extraction and trying to do the best to sew these sutures, these stitches, right, in the open wounds of our ecological body. There are other forms of wetland restoration that take a very different form. For example, communities that are going out and planting marsh grass by hand. Now, how, quote unquote, productive will this be in reversing the loss of 2,000 square miles of land? It's unlikely to be very productive, but it does represent another way of actually existing with one's wider ecology, of making these offerings, of providing these gestures, of offering your body, you know, your spirit, your you know, this engaged kind of form of resistance and acknowledgement of the need, you know, to be a part, right, of the constant building and rebuilding of this land, of this ecology, right? It harkens to what I mentioned previously of this indigenous practice of just eating and these oyster shells actually building the land, of being a part of the maintenance of our own existence. I don't think often of memorials in the sense of concrete memorials. I unfortunately don't really have anything to say about them. I think of memorials that are forgotten, that are living, that are thriving, that can't be actually calcified as being the most valuable. I see these sacred groves, indeed, as you pointed out, as a living kind of memorial and testament, and something that is so much more monumental than even the space that it holds, right? So I think I'll just end it there.
Sammy, there was a question on memory and maybe another on transmission. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. But I think I will answer in general, because I think that somehow the questions are connected when it comes to justice, but even memorial or even memory, but also just the freedom of belonging to a territory that owners actually are living and deciding what can be done in relation to the experience of and the knowledge of the territory itself. So I would like many to think about, we should start by thinking around the notion of economy, where it started, as knowing that it started in the plantations before going to Brazil, and it's still the same economy that we're still living in today, and its evolution. That brings me also to speak about even the colonial system during for example, the time in Congo. It's that the land has been taken from owners, actually, and it's been also divided. So how can we talk about the environmental justice, or talking about justice, but even installing a memory or even a transmission, why people somehow are excluded from the territories? And I mean, Imani's been saying about the slaves that they couldn't even have a grave. So I think so a kind of concrete example can be For example, the fact that since the colonial system to now, Congo is never allowed to process the mineral resources. So they are all going out in a raw shape and then processed outside. And when it comes back in a final product, it's so expensive that no one can be able to even below that, we're talking about the land and memory. And I mean, there's this constitution that is still in application in Congo that says that, and it's been chosen since 64 by Mobutu, which is a reconstruction of colonial system where it says that the land and what is under the land belong to the state, while the state itself, it's a colonial invention. And you all know how those governments are so fragile, but are also depending on the economy that mainly comes from outside. So my point should be maybe to look at the economy, but to look at also this justice of how people can really take the land back somehow.
I like that. We finished. Okay, so we come to the we come to the end. Kader will close the.
Sorry, you have some sound here. Okay. So this is just the beginning of our event. Huh? It is just an appetizer. There are, of course, between Imani, Sammy, and Malcom, words that came to my mind as question also. And I would even probably really emphasize what you said when you said we have to make the world the horizon of ecology and not the contrary, which I read in your book, Decolonial Ecology, has a very strong statement. Was it a conversation with Arturo Escobar on this Mother Earth? No? Yeah.
Yeah, part of it.
So, yeah. It's very, very important. And I think there was another point that I also wanted to ask you, Malcom, because I found out something very interesting. I have the impression that you questioned, or you were expecting a sort of question regarding the use of the term decolonial, which I completely understand. Talking about all these compass cardinal points I was speaking, how could you connect decolonial with feminism or with ecology or with other topics? I mean, we will need to reinvent a new vocabulary. I don't think that the word decolonial is enough to carry all the complexity of the problem we have to face. Like Alexandro Petit from Decolonizing Architecture told me, maybe we should think about demodernizing, maybe. But why this is so important for you in relation with ecology? Why I felt that you were skeptical about this?
About the use of the word decolonial.
Colonial, yeah.
So I situate my work both in the conceptual academic field, but also in the political activists position. And so, to me, speaking about decolonial, it's not the only proposition that I make, but speaking about the decolonial is also situating myself within a struggle of those that are seeking forms of reparations, forms of justice. So it's important to say, okay, well, that's where we are now. But the horizon of the decolonial struggle cannot be decolonial itself, decoloniality itself. That's where I think we need to invent different words, different themes. That's why the word world is important to me. Because what does it mean to decolonize? To me, it means allowing the possibility of a plurality of worlds, of beings, to encounter one another under the conditions of equality, dignity, and justice. How do you get to that? And I think decoloniality is a path to get to that. But it's not an end in itself. So I use the decolonial strategically. It does something, but maybe there are other words